Hello and welcome everyone to this month's New Directions webinar series. Today we're talking about opening Pandora's box, multilingualism in assessment. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping points. The session will be recorded and the link will be shared post-webinar. Please avoid using AI note takers where possible in the automatic messages because it can be distracting. Use the Q&A button, top of your screen, for questions. And please upvote questions that are of interest to you because we will be drawing on these towards the second part of the webinar. Attendance certificates will be available on completion of the feedback survey, so remember to do that. And the survey link will be shared in the chat at the end of the session. The presentation slides will be sent to participants via email after completion of the survey. So welcome again, everyone. And my name's Dr. Cheryl Cook. I work with the British Council in research, engagement and dissemination, particularly around language learning and language assessment. The topic for this webinar grew out of the New Directions conference we held in Nairobi, Kenya in September 2024, where multilingualism was a key theme. At that conference, I shared a quote from Kenyan author Yvonne Adhiambo Owor's novel, The Dragonfly Sea, which I would like to quote again here. In this world, English has the biggest ears. This quote speaks to the communicative power of English as a lingua franca across international borders and a number of different domains. It is the tongue of a diverse range of speakers, and for the majority of these millions of people, it is a language alongside other languages that collectively make up their lived communicative reality. I like to think of these speakers as linguistic chameleons, adapting their linguistic repertoires to their audience and to the communicative context. They are virtuoso verbalists whose value is only beginning to be leveraged in language learning and is barely a whisper in the field of language assessment. Perhaps this is because the implications of multilingualism and the multilingual test taker are complex and challenging. To loudly vocalize the need to consider and include multilingualism in a language assessment construct is to open the proverbial Pandora's box. Here with me today, ready to reinterpret the metaphorical evils escaping the box, are leading scholars in English as a lingua franca, multilingualism and translanguaging from around the world. I'm delighted to welcome our panelists from the Nairobi conference back for a virtual discussion. Okay. And to our panelists. First of all, I'd like to welcome Professor Lekhethi Makalela, who has many accolades to his name, including founding director, Hub for Multilingual Education and Literacies at the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa. He is also deputy head of Wits School of Education, Research and Innovation, and visiting scholar to a number of different international universities. I'd also like to welcome Professor Leena Mukhopadhyay, who is professor at the English and Foreign Languages University in Hyderabad in India. Also, Dr. Alessio Kogo, renowned scholar in the field of English as a lingua franca and editor-in-chief of the ELT Journal. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to be moderating this session today. Before we begin, before we hear from our speakers and scholars, I would like to get your opinions, and you will see a poll appearing on your screen with 3 short questions. Please take a minute to answer these 3 questions. You can see in the bottom right-hand corner an arrow for you to move to the 2nd and 3rd questions. I'm really keen to know what you think. You should be able to continue voting in the poll by going to the polls button at the top of your screen. Now, we'll give each of the speakers an opportunity to present their ideas before we open up the discussion. Please remember to put your questions in the chat and to upvote questions that you would like the speakers to answer. First of all, I'd like to invite Dr. Alessio Kogo.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you for your introduction as well. Let me share my slides. I hope you can see my slides. Okay. Okay, thank you all. Thank you for being here, wherever you are. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. I'm here to start the discussion on this very interesting topic, but I would like also to thank you, Cheryl, and thank you, the British Council, for inviting me and providing this platform to discuss this important topic. So what I'll do, I'll talk about English as a lingua franca and multilingualism, and especially why they matter for assessment. So the first concept I'd like to talk about is English as a lingua franca, or ELF for short. So English is used widely across the world in our classrooms, in workplaces, but also in refugees context, in research teams around the world, in global communication. But is it always the same form of English? Well, when talking about English as a lingua franca, what I would like to do is to reflect on the diversity of English in the world. So in this slide, for instance, you can see some of the many publications that address ELF for short, ELF research, communication, classroom practices, and assessment. I will provide the full references at the end, and also the slides will be made available too. Okay, so what is English as a lingua franca? In simple terms, English as a lingua franca refers to English used as a common language among speakers with different linguistic and cultural backgrounds. The idea is that ELF focuses on effective communication, which is more important than native-like accuracy in language use. So the idea of making sense, mutual understanding, it moves away from teaching and learning English according to a native speaker perspective and emphasizes the diversity of English. For that reason, it's also an inclusive and practical approach. It acknowledges that speakers often adapt language creatively in what we call accommodation strategies to achieve clarity, which is essential in international and multicultural context. So why is this important? Understanding English as a lingua franca is crucial for educators and also for assessors because it reflects how English operates in real-life scenarios around the world, and it influences how language competence should be evaluated. But let me move on to the second concept, the idea of more generally of multilingualism and specifically translanguaging. Again, these are some of the publications that you can find around this topic. Communication rarely happens in a single language. So multilingual speakers often draw on all their linguistic repertoire, all their linguistic resources to express themselves fully. This practice is called translanguaging. Now, translanguaging involves mixing and switching between languages in a fluid and creative way, and it challenges the notion that languages should remain separate. The focus with translanguaging, like in English as a lingua franca, is communication, not perfection, according to a monolingual perspective. And why is this powerful? Because it reflects how people really communicate in the world. In education, for instance, it promotes inclusivity and collaboration, giving every learner in the classroom a voice. So rather than viewing this as incorrect or confusing, educators increasingly recognize it as a strength that fosters learning, collaboration, and inclusivity. Multilingual approaches in English language teaching are also gaining traction because they reflect authentic communication patterns, but also because they empower our learners to use their whole entire repertoire. This shift is particularly important for our discussion today because it has got significant implications for assessment design and fairness. But it's got important challenges as well. Language assessment nowadays often assumes a monolingual ideal based on standard English norms. These tests prioritize grammatical accuracy and native-like fluency, which do not align with real-world communication practices, where English as a lingua franca and translanguaging dominate. Now, this creates a disconnect between what is tested and how language is actually used, so we desperately need assessment reform. And key questions arise. Can learners demonstrate understanding through multiple languages? Should assessment allow translanguaging as part of performance? So addressing these questions requires rethinking success criteria, developing assessment models that value communicative competence over rigid linguistic conformity. Now, some work in this direction has already started. For instance, see Constance Leung and Jenny Jenkins' work in ELF assessment. But considering ELF and translanguaging in assessment is often described as, Cheryl says, opening Pandora's box, because it introduces complex issues related to fairness, validity, and inclusivity. However, these complexities should not deter innovation. Instead, they should be seen as opportunities that allow us to develop more inclusive and meaningful assessment. And with this, I finish my very short introduction and hand over to Cheryl.
Thank you very much, Alessia. Very interesting and setting the broader context of ELF for our discussion. We're now going to move on to Professor Makalela, who's going to be focusing on translanguaging, which Alessia has already provided a useful introduction to.
Thank you, Program Director, and thank you for the introduction. And thank you, colleagues from all over the world, for attending this amazing session. As I start, I wanted to say that South Africa, where I'm based, for the first time in the history of this country, we have administered bilingual assessments at grade 4 in math, science, and technology English, alongside African languages. I speak here about assessment regime, and for a reason of inclusivity, as not a one parcel of assessment that programs globally have been focusing on. Next slide. So let's define translanguaging briefly. It was defined, so that made this presentation easier. It is not translation, because translation is meaning exactness, is not interpreting, is also not code switching, because code switching is the hearer, what the hearer does hear, and not necessarily what the speaker does or say. The difference is that one is external to the speaker, and whereas translanguaging is internal. The key term here is about meaning continuum. We focus on what speakers do with the languages rather than what the languages look like. As you see in the concept languaging, it's about meaning making, and then you transport the meaning across a number of what we term socially named languages, but your meaning is coherent throughout, irrespective of the language that you hear. Next slide. With this in mind, then we can take several key takeaways that translanguaging is in fact individual. It's about the individual speaker and not about the hearer, and therefore it's internal. All learners in your classroom, 1,000 of them, whatever number, they can translanguage individually. And therefore, there's no expectation on the part of the teacher to know the children or the learners' languages. right? If the teacher does know that, it's a bonus, but it's not a precondition. So translanguaging help us also to move into what we call learning. Epistemologically, the focus is on learning, not necessarily teacher. We talk about learner-centered approach in the 21st century. Next slide. And it's because of this, the aim of the teacher is not to sweat in the classroom, but the teacher facilitates learning. And if learning is going to be facilitated with multiple languages planned, then we talk about mini lessons that are created. And this is where translanguaging or a number of languages coexist. The next one. It is in this actual lesson plan where the use of English alongside other languages is possible. If you begin from, we are not speaking about organic translanguaging, we're talking about pedagogical. What does that mean? It means systematic, it's planned, it's not random. So in the beginning of the lesson, you have pre-lesson activities, and this could mean activating prior knowledge in more than one language. Every child has got their other language and they use English. Scaffolding key concepts in more than one language. And I'm interested precisely on on the middle part, which is during the lesson. So we start as an individual. Every child can deal with a concept in the language that they know other than English. But the next part in this series is that now you move them in a mini lesson, cognate languages, the languages that are related or they're close to one another, where they deal or they solve a particular problem. Could be a metaphor or anything that you focus on as content. And then the third part, where is intentionally you're moving children or learners into spaces where they use languages that are not related, and that is intentional. At this stage, you're forcing or you're encouraging them to move into highest cognitive place. That's where meta-linguistic awareness become key. Then they won't understand each other, obviously, in this case, and they begin to use English as the medium of understanding concept in the other languages. This is the space where the teacher can eavesdrop or listen to what they're saying, but you have an opportunity for them to report back in the main lesson. So translanguage would have happened in all these spaces. In the post-lesson activity, they can exit, summarize in a sentence or two in English and the other language you know. A multilingual response, this is an emotional response to the lesson, response in English and the other language. And you can say, what is the one thing that you take away from the lesson, and you do it multilingually. So what you have seen here, we're already engaged in some kind of assessment. So self-assessment is embedded in here. That's what we call assessment as learning. This part, the post-lesson activities, are engaging learners into metacognition. In other words, they begin to think about their own thinking, and you can only arrive at that stage if you use more than one language to get to that. Okay, the next slide. So what about assessment? Many educators globally are asking the question, yes, you can teach in more than one language, but what about assessment? But that question is almost tantamount to, what about us, right? Because if we think about the lesson that we have just seen, it deals with assessment as learning. You know, the whole ecology, you have got assessment for learning, where the peers were doing stuff, but also teachers can do that. The real contention comes in with assessment of learning, which is your end high stake assessments. The next one. So we're explaining the ecology very briefly, that learners monitor their own. Example here is journals, voice notes, short multilingual reflections, peer assessment, comments, or collaborative rubrics, and the teacher assessment, weighted mark combining content mastery and reflective insights on multilingual meaning making. The next slide. So traditional assessment taxonomies like Bloom, they assume one language cognition. Ubuntu translanguaging reframes language as a thinking partner across repertoires. Okay, so learning progresses through cross-linguistic reasoning, what you call recall, interpreting, create through multiple languages. And then the next slide. And this is then we arrive at this, in fact, away from assessment as learning, assessment of learning, and assessment for learning. We also actually have assessment through learning, where you are now is community-based kind of project, oral stories, interviews that would happen in more than one language, depending on the linguistic composition of the community. Because from the Ubuntu logic, then we can say, I assess because we assess and we learn together. The next slide. So I'll end on this core principle of the ecology of assessment, which is that assessment by nature is continuous. It's not a one-stop. And multilingual learning is cumulative. Okay. So when learning happens multilingually, assessment must reflect the same ecology. Teachers don't need to know all the learners' languages. Rather, they need to recognize and value multilingual processes that shaped the final product. This is very key. By the time we arrive at high-stake assessment, learners will have already done the following. They would have negotiated meaning through peer discussions, multilingual notes, group work, receive feedback via assessment, self-assessment and peer assessment in languages other than English, but reflected through multilingual journals or 1-minute takeaways, as we have demonstrated. And the landing point, therefore, is that our final product represent a culmination of multilingual cognition. And the final expression, because the lesson, the output is to learn English, the expression is in English. The teacher, therefore, assesses the outcomes, not necessarily the linguistic medium. I'll pause here and then we can take. Thank you, Program Director.
Thank you very much, Professor Makalela. Very good and interesting introduction to some of those ideas. I'll pick up on a few points when we come to the discussion, but let's hear from Professor Mukhopadhyay first. Lena.
Thank you, Cheryl, for opening this platform for us. And I would also like to thank British Council for giving us this opportunity to continue with our discussion we had started in the Nairobi conference last year. And I'm very happy to again connect with Alicia and Leketi on this and to add to the Pandora's box, but not in a negative way, but in a positive way to celebrate English as a lingua franca, translanguaging within our assessment models. I would like to make a short presentation. So let me begin by sharing my slides. Right, I would like to talk a bit about the construct of multilingual assessment, building on the concept of translanguaging and English as a lingua franca. So if we look at the concept of multilingual education from the global perspective, what research shows us that multilingual learners experience heightened cognitive flexibility, executive functions, and denser neural adaptations, which means that they are able to attend to tasks with a heightened awareness. And because they constantly keep juggling between languages, that gives rise to heightened awareness and also heightened linguistic cultural awareness to communicate, appreciate diversity and adaptability. So this is what research shows us. And also from times immemorial, multilingualism has been the normal human condition for 3/4 of our human existence, and Indian and many global societies like African societies mirrors this condition. Moreover, linguistic justice calls for majority of the world's children to experience home language to language of instruction overlap, and we can extend this to using multiple languages for formative assessment. So I'd like to share a few examples of how we can use multilingual assessment for formative purposes. May not be for summative purposes because that requires changes at the policy level, but hoping that someday it will gain that kind of recognition. So I'd like to present some examples from the research that we have been conducting over the last 10 or 11 years. And I will leave you with some sources from our research reports, which actually have, discussions and presentation of findings based on multilingual assessment. So before that, I'd also like to, bring about some of the challenges and myths to using multiple languages in EMI classrooms and also using multiple languages for assessment. So many a times teachers and policymakers in the global south often support English-only policy because of societal prestige and a populist belief that immersion is the best method to teach English. However, this might not always be the case. They also express concern regarding reduced input or negative transfer if multiple languages are used alongside the target language English. So that assumption is also questionable in today's context, given the fact that there is a lot of empirical evidence. And as Alicia was showing through multiple publications that are both translanguaging and English as a lingua franca for communicative purposes shows positive performance or use of English for content expression and language proficiency worldwide. And very importantly, code-switched communication, though is normal and frequent in multilingual societies in the global south, in class it is frowned upon. So how do we, utilize this kind of a multilingual resource, which is quite a normative behavior within the classroom context? So why multilingual assessment? Because if children are encouraged to learn through their whole language repertoire, which Professor Makalela and Professor Kogo were referring to, they should be ideally able to rely on multiple languages when being assessed. So we maintain the continuity between learning and assessment, and we focus on learning as and for assessment rather than assessment of learning. So I'd like to now present an example from a multilingual reading assessment that we have used in our research for some time, and we have seen positive impact of using such models of multilingual assessment. So before that, let us look at what could be considered as multilingual assessment. So for a teacher, it would mean use of other languages apart from just the language of the textbook or the target language while assessing a learner or a set of learners. So it can be in two ways. One is in terms of presenting the input. So teachers can use multiple languages in designing the tasks or the items at hand. And the items could be, discrete point like multiple choice, true and false, going on to limited structured responses, and then free responses. And on the other hand, we could consider the concept of output, where teachers would have to accept the mixing of languages along with English in free responses of the children or beginners level learners of English to begin with, but they could also be used at the tertiary level. So teachers would need to have a model with which, or a rubric with which they can handle the output that has instances of language mixing. So let us look at an example. This is an example from multilingual reading assessment we tried out with low SES children from primary grades 4 and 5, where we looked at expository texts, because expository texts are the ones which are used across classes. So EVS, mathematics, science, physics, geography, etc., etc. And we also had narrative text, but here I'm only focusing on expository text. So let's say the text is presented in English, and then the multiple choice items, which is the input. Like I said, that teachers have to plan how to use multiple languages in designing tasks and items. So one model could be presenting the multiple choice items in home languages. So here I have given examples of Hindi and Assamese, which are two Indian languages which were used in the sites of our data collection, and we also had the English counterpart. So depending on the model of assessment that the teacher would like to use, there could be flexibility in terms of presenting the language of input. And then if there are free responses, like what Professor Makalela was referring to in his lesson plan, especially I like the post-lesson stage where you have talked about 1 minute multilingual exit quiz, and then effective responses through using multiple languages, expressing summary or comprehension of the content. So that would be the writing of the answers, free responses using English along with other languages. And for that, the teachers would need to have a rubric where they can incentivize the learners in terms of recognizing their use of both the languages in a creative manner. To put this across in a nutshell, that there are several benefits of multilingual assessments. Primarily, it promotes equity amongst different learner speaker communities. It supports language development in a holistic manner, because we do not look at monolingual competence, but we can look at multilingual competence, and also the expression and comprehension of a particular content across different languages. And over time, it can also increase accuracy across languages, and definitely it would enhance student involvement, like as Professor Makalela was suggesting, that we could bring in self and peer assessment through the multilingual mode of assessment. So it would be a platform to help students become more engaged, because they can use their home languages. It would give rise to heightened self-esteem, and also more engagement with the teaching learning context. And I'd like to leave you with an example of classroom assessment in multilingual in multiple languages by Margot Gottlieb, which is a recent book, and it has fantastic ideas about how teachers can use multiple languages in assessment, both for formative and summative purposes. So you could pick up ideas from this book. And finally, some practical tips for conducting English assessments multilingually. So one of the things that we need to, tell ourselves, that we have to embed such assessments into our lesson plans, and it is not something external to that. So the more regularly we are able to do that and use rubrics to assess use of language mixing meaningfully and creatively, that would, make the assessments more successful. So for example, again, to pick up on this construct of cognate and non-cognate examples. So in the Indian context, if we are using English along with other Indian languages, they are all non-cognate. But between Indian languages, they could be cognates, right? So metaphors is a construct which can be present across languages, irrespective of whether they're cognates or non-cognates. But multi-word phrases like phrasal verbs are present in English, but they are not present in languages, many Indian languages like Malayalam, Tamil, Bengali, so on and so forth. So there are certain areas of meta-linguistic awareness that the teachers can utilize to make a plan that, okay, where language mixing is possible and where it would not be possible. So that would help them create the rubrics. And alongside that, the teachers can give feedback. So especially where the distance between the languages are vast, then chances are there would be some errors in those areas. And the teachers can, give constructive feedback along those areas, instead of, picking faults that, okay, you have this as a grammar mistake and this can never be sorted, so on and so forth. And then also encourage reflection to raise meta-linguistic awareness about languages. So that can be also embedded as feedback for using multiple languages in English assessments. And collect multimodal artifacts. So in these days, a lot of things are possible through digitization. So teachers can, in smaller cohorts, use multimodal, multilingual artifacts, collect them from children over time, so that they have a comprehensive understanding of their competence across languages. And at the end of the day, it would be like enjoying and sharing and supporting learning instances of your learners with pride and heightened self-esteem. So these are the two sources that I would like to share. So the first one is from our landmark research, Multilila, conducted between 2016 to 2020, where we have instances of multilingual assessments, and the one which is recently running in the eastern part of India and northern part, called Multi-Ed in India. And there we have empirical evidence to show how multilingual, multimodal reading assessments have a positive impact on learner performance in expository texts and narrative texts. So with that, I would like to end my presentation.
Thank you very much, Lena. And there were some really great practical examples there. just a reminder to everyone, the poll, you can still vote in the poll if you haven't yet. If you go to the top of your screen and you click on the More button, you should be able to see the polls. And once you've voted, you can see the results as well. So thank you. Great. Also, just a reminder to put your questions in the chat. I see we already have some questions there. And before we go to take some of those questions from the audience, I'd just like to ask a few broader questions of our speakers today. I think, great, everyone's back, super. Thank you. Do we have, great. So just to begin with, Professor Makalela, you spoke about translanguaging, but you also spoke about Ubuntu translanguaging, and we have people on this webinar from Guatemala, Uzbekistan, Vietnam, Spain, and I just wonder if you could very briefly, in a very simple terms, tell our audience what you mean by Ubuntu and Ubuntu translanguaging.
Thank you for that. Yes, Ubuntu is an African philosophy of interdependence, and we say there's more to a person is a person because of other persons. Therefore, our African languages, especially from here, languages of Bantu origin, are so much related. The boundaries between them are so blurred. In other words, they're much more working horizontally rather than vertically. So other kinds of translanguaging is about two languages sitting in separate poles. Here, what we have done is to look at languages that are used more horizontally. It's a kind of horizontal type of multilingualism where languages flow, they leak into each other very easily and without any boundaries. It's typical in African context for you to receive me speaking two languages to you at the same time, and then you respond to me in three other languages, that the boundaries is far much more complex type of translanguaging than what you hear in the Northern Hemisphere, which is two separated languages that are so clean.
Thank you, and thanks for those examples. I think you've spoken before about compartmentalizing languages, and I'll get back to that in a moment. In the meantime, it seems that there are two broad concepts that we're talking about here. One is the sort of broader context of English as a lingua franca, where we have people speaking different types of English, bringing in their own identities and their own languages into the Englishes that they speak. And then we've got the other sort of concept of what is in the minds of speakers, where there's this very complex repertoire of different languages. And Alessia, I was wanting to ask you, considering this really fluid, dynamic nature of English as a lingua franca, how does a language assessment rise to the challenge? What can be done when language assessment loves standard forms and standardization? You spoke about that diversity of Englishes. What would you see as a way to rise to that challenge?
Yes, thank you, Sherry, for that question. I think it's not an easy question. It's complex, and you might have to consider different answers for different contexts. For English as a lingua franca that is so diverse and that includes aspects of multilingualism, translanguaging, depending on the context where it is used and constructed, then you might have to look at who we are testing, what we are testing, what's the aim of assessment. So I found it really useful that Professor Makalele talked about the difference between assessment for learning, assessment as learning, instead of just assessing learning or assessment of learning, right? And I think in a situation like we are at the moment, we need to consider how we can assess our students regularly in a comprehensive way, where we include all their linguistic resources through more organic kind of assessment, maybe portfolios of assessment, where we are not only looking at one item with one right or wrong answer, but where, depending on the context and the students that we are assessing, we might have different possibilities. And it's challenging. It's challenging because, as we said, up to now, tests are the kind of tests we have at the moment refer to the ideal standard. There's usually specific items that you need to answer, tasks that you need to deal with that have got a right or wrong answer, right? Yeah. So I haven't answered, really.
There are increasing calls, though. For example, Ilana Shohami, as far back as 2018, was calling for English language testing, specifically to take ELF seriously and start making changes. Lena, you made a point about English-only classrooms, and you touched on something that I think is quite interesting. English learning, I think, around the world is frequently driven by very aspirational motivation. And, even when learners accept and appreciate learning in a multilingual context, sometimes the parents, for example, don't appreciate often paying quite a lot to send their children to English medium instruction schools, and then having this multilingual situation. So how would you say we can convince a broader range of stakeholders that multilingual classrooms are beneficial?
Right. Thank you, Cheryl, for that very pertinent question. And I don't have any easy answer to that. However, what I would like to, build on is what Professor Makalela has proposed as Ubuntu translanguaging. And I can totally relate to it because in Indian communities also, there is, I would say, a very similar situation happening where if the speakers are from 3 or 4 different communities and they have a shared knowledge of languages, they easily switch from one language to another, both in terms of hearing and speaking. So it's very normally done. And there is no, yardstick to say that, okay, this is negative communication, right? So I think the same is with English as a lingua franca. So I was, we were, talking in this webinar, I was suddenly reminded of the concept of received pronunciation for English, and then how in today's world we have different pronunciation, right? And that is like mutually intelligible. So now if somebody says that, okay, I'm working on RP, we kind of frown upon them, right? So it's the same with ELF, like you said, that Shomi was trying to bring it in, make it more mainstream. So the thing is, in the Indian context, I would specifically talk about a very peculiar problem in the Indian context that we have been grappling with for the last 10 years, is that many of the Indian languages, which are mainstream languages, are very old. And traditionally, there is a big divide between the oral register and the written register. Whereas in a language like English, it is not such a case. So even if it is academic language and it is, so if we look at Cummins's concept of BICS and CAL, although we know that academic register is more, formal and probably clausally more dense than oral language or communicative language, but still the distance between these two registers is not too far. Whereas in Indian languages, the moment we think of using multiple languages in the English classroom, we have to be very careful, because if the teachers start using the written registers of the Indian languages, then it's like opening another kind of Pandora's box. So what we have been experimenting with is the use of multiple languages with the oral register. Otherwise, otherwise it is lost on the children. Then it is again building on that linguistic hierarchy where we look at the written system as more prestigious and that is more standardized and that is what should be used in education. So it is a fine balance between the registers, the use of multilingualism and English. Now, when it comes to the parents, there is data to show in India that the most disadvantaged families, the parents spend most on their education of their children, and they end up sending them to private English medium schools, which do not offer that kind of quality education. And so, yeah, it's very difficult to deal with parental aspirations and convince them that, okay, English is not a monolithic, concept, but then there are varieties of English, and which one would you be using in a particular context? So I think a kind of a context sensitization, that for what reason the language has to be used and the assessment of it or the teaching of it is bound by that, then that I think would be a way forward. But more and more, I think along with teachers and administrators, parents and community speakers have to be brought into the fold to understand that, okay, English, learning of English or assessment or performance of English in assessment is just not a monolithic term. It is much beyond that. Otherwise, it's like only going back to RP for pronunciation. So that's the best example that I can give.
I think that's a really useful parallel to draw. And yeah, it is a mind shift change, right? Sort of seeing multilingualism as a benefit rather than a negative. I'd like to go to a couple of questions from the audience, and this is a very practical one that's been upvoted as well. And it says, what happens if the teacher or assessor of oral English does not speak the language a student uses for their internal translanguaging process? And perhaps, Professor Makalela, we can start with you. You have some experience of this, but I'll bring the others in as well.
Yes, I'm the one that said that the teacher doesn't need to know the learner's language. Is true, depending on what you do. But as you say, start with the individual, and you can group learners according to cognate languages that are related to one another. If you do that, you are providing a resource for one of the children from that group must be able to speak back to the teacher what that means. But if you also have kids, sometimes this is overrated, the multilingualism as a problem. The children are not brought into a classroom through some kind of a parachute. They are already living communities of kids that are outside of the school. They form a community. That's what you leverage on. And based on that, there is a solution inside the classroom, not even from the teacher or elsewhere. The point of having these mini lessons is to provide affordances for the kids to use different languages, but come back to use English, in other words, the language of the teacher in that case. So if it's an oral exam that the child speaks in a different language, that cannot be the end product. The end product is to use more than one language, not just the child's language. They can say it in their own language, and they say the same thing in the language that the teacher would understand. So I'm very comfortable with that, and it's not a contradiction.
And it's interesting because you're tapping into a kind of a skill where someone's trying to, interpret and to bring these things together to be able to tell the teacher as well. Alessia, do you have any comments on that very practical question?
Sorry for that. I keep on trying to avoid the sun through the No, I completely agree, and I think it's important to think about us as facilitators, as Professor Makalela was saying before, us teachers and educators as facilitators, and really leverage the multilingualism in the classroom. And our assessment should reflect what is in the classroom. That's the problem at the moment, is that assessment tends to be standardized and according to standard English, usually British and American. And I think considering health and more multilingual practices would make it more equitable and possibly more powerful as well for the students as well to recognize it.
Yeah. Lena. You're on mute, sorry.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. Yeah, I also, I mean, think that we still have a long way to go to understand, the empirical benefits of using multilingualism in English classrooms, because there is always a tension, and I can see from the chat box, one of the teachers possibly has asked that does translanguaging hinder fluency in English? So what I would like to propose is that, okay, fluency, if we look at it as a monolingual construct, then probably yes. But then if we look at fluency as a meaning making process, then nothing stops us from asking the children to express, or young adults to express their understanding of the ideas and links between ideas in a language that they are more comfortable, and then paraphrase it in English where the teacher can scaffold in terms of doing it through revisions and showing better examples of how it can be made more coherent, or the argumentation can have some clarity, etc., etc. So it's not like looking at responses as a final response, but that's why I suggested that multilingual assessment can be very beautifully used for formative purposes, where the teacher thinks about the language of input and the languages of output. And if it is a receptive task, like multiple choice item, to assess comprehension of a text, then the teacher can play around with the languages of input. But if the teacher has to accept the languages of output, which are the responses of the children in oral or in writing, there can be several stages. And if my aim as a teacher is to assess fluency, then I could begin with what the child is able to do in a particular language or through two languages, and then move to the language of English and see how well the communication is coming across. So it's not a one-tiered process. That is what I would like to suggest. So it's definitely not a threat to fluency.
Thank you. I think that kind of segues into one of the sort of themes that's coming through in the questions quite a lot, and that's, we've talked about formative assessment, we've talked about using learners' languages for assessment for learning, but this idea of summative assessment, I see one of our colleagues, John, has mentioned it. Some others have asked about, will translanguaging be allowed in the IELTS exam? And when we come to these high stakes international exams, which obviously can't be translanguaging exams, because how could we possibly do that? How does the translanguaging and multilingual approach to teaching, how does that begin to address this idea that the student, the multilingual learner, will need to write these high stakes summative exams at some point? And I'll open it up to whoever would like to start.
Okay, I can start. So with high stakes assessments, as we say that continuous assessment is continuous. When you get to the high stakes standardized exam, it assumes that learning happened, and learning could have happened multilingually with all these linguistic repertoires being used. So then you want to take the high stake assessment, and then it should be a culmination. It should reflect that people are able to use more than one language, even in the high stake assessment. The lecturer or the marker, the assessor, is not looking at the language. You are looking at the multilingual competence right? Just like when you write a dissertation, you interview people in a different language, but you're writing that in English. So you have a quotation that is in the other language, and then you run an explanation. The idea here would be to the multilingual thinking that you are access to the deeper digestion of that content, knowledge, whatever that the topic is deeper. You could ask, because they've done it in the teaching, in the learning process. Therefore, in the high-stake assessment, it's about time to rethink the high-stake assessment that they should reflect. You are not saying they should write in more than one language. At the end, you can exit in English, absolutely. But the assessment is not just the medium, it is the content knowledge, and you can demonstrate how that, let's say, is a metaphor about I'm hungry, say that in English. In African language, you'll never say I'm hungry, you say I am being killed by hunger, right? So in a high stakes assessment, you want to see the intersectionality of the meaning of hunger based on contributions from another language other than English. Do you see that? So it's not impossible. What we're assessing is not a multilingual person can exit, can be monolingual, just like me now. I speak a number of languages, but at this point, I'm sensitive to who I'm speaking to. I can produce a monolingual text. But the kids, the learners would have also practiced exiting in English, exiting the other language throughout the assessment as learning, through learning, the projects that they were doing. So the final product cannot be completely isolated from what has been happening. That's why learning drives assessment and not the other way around.
True.
So that would
Thank
be
you.
my response.
Thank you. Lena and Alessia, any comments on that? Because I think it ties together with, the classroom, but also with what English is when it's being performed.
If I may add something, I completely agree, but I think we also need more efforts to change language policies, to move more towards more equitable ways and more linguistic diverse ways of exit as well. So more assessment, standardized assessment that recognizes English as a lingua franca and translanguaging practices as an exit point as well.
And I'd like to add to that by saying that we also need to, add to teacher agency, that they feel responsible for the fact that, like as Professor Makalela and Professor Kogo were referring to, that using multiple languages as their mode of expression as well as monolingual mode of expression. So we need to make a distinction between assessments for achievement purposes versus filtration. So when they reach to the level of filtration, if they have been consistently using multiple languages to understand the content, express the content, then they will be at a position where they can also function monolingually. But very importantly, I think ELF as a policy, acceptance of that in high stakes exam is a different, I would say, war or struggle. And that also we need to, achieve at some point, isn't it, Alicia? What do you feel?
I think that's the big struggle, to recognize that there's also different kinds of Englishes that can be exit points. Yeah.
Yes.
And that needs to be done at a more policy level, at a higher level, not only in the
with
class.
more empirical evidence in a structured manner. Absolutely.
Yeah. Great. Well, this is a very good example of World Englishes right here on this webinar. And unfortunately, that's all we have time for now. But I think the points that have been made about, a multilingual learner being able to speak monolingually when they need to, despite what may be going on and what has gone on inside, I think is a very good example and taps into the whole linguistic chameleon metaphor as well. So just enough time to say thank you very much to our fantastic speakers. Thanks to the audience for your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but please do complete the survey, and then we will be sending out slides as well. The survey link will be in the chat, so please complete that so that you can get your attendance certificates, and you can also receive copies of the PPTs. And please do have a look out. We have a New Directions newsletter that goes out regularly, and we will be updating you with things about multilingualism and everything else related to language assessment. One more point, anyone who's particularly interested in language assessment, the British Council is collaborating with the University of Reading in the UK to offer a short, intensive postgraduate certificate in language assessment. And you can find out more by scanning the QR code. And thank you very much to our speakers from South Africa, the UK, and India as well. Wonderful to have you on the webinar, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye,
so
everyone.
much. Thank you. Bye-bye.